for Provashi.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's always a privilege to stand in this House to speak on important matters to not only my constituents but to all Canadians. And it's always good to be able to do so in great detail, delving into the various areas of importance of a given issue. Clearly, the House has not yet had ample time to consider this matter of privilege set before us and the full ramifications of this government's failures. So we're happy to continue in our quest to help the government understand this issue, to give them the opportunity to consider, perhaps even reconsider, their position and take the steps that the House has been requesting for some time now, to stop holding up the House business and that the nation turn over, and that of the nation, and to turn over the documents so we can get back to the pressing issues concerning Canadians, rather than the political issues that appear to be so concerning to this Liberal government. You know, this passion for secrecy and cover-ups that define this government is deeply troubling. When we look at the scandals of this government, this failed and corrupt Prime Minister, it's really quite astounding. The Alpha Khan Island scandal, SNC-Lavalin, the We Charity, billions in so-called COVID spending that found its way into the pockets of Liberal insiders, Arrive Can scam, McKinsey, the Green Slush Fund, foreign interference, and the degree to which China has been allowed to infiltrate this country and put our citizens at risk. The list goes on, and most of that's just the Prime Minister. Throw in a few of his ministers and the list gets exponentially longer. Every time they seek to cover up the truth from Canadians, they refuse to produce documents, refuse to be transparent, refuse to answer the most basic questions, and they can't even bring themselves to tell us who the real Randy is. It's just sad. Small wonder a growing majority of Canadians no longer trust them and are champing at a bit to throw them out of office. You know, I had to laugh the other week. The Minister of Innovation, the same minister, by the way, who was in charge of overseeing the Sustainable Development Technology Canada, or also known as the SDTC, this Green Slush Fund that we're going to keep talking about. He's a nice guy, but he said the other week, the question being asked on every street corner in Canada is, why won't the Leader of the Opposition get his security clearance? Well, that just shows how out of touch with Canadians this government is. It tells me that this minister hasn't even ventured very far beyond the Wellington in recent months. Because I can tell him that is not the question that Canadians are asking. They're not asking that of me in my riding, and I'm there talking to my constituents. This is the question that I'm being asked. You want to know what I hear every single day, Madam Speaker? And often multiple times in a day, it's when can we get rid of this Prime Minister? We need to get rid of this Prime Minister. We need to get rid of those corrupt Liberals who are destroying our country. It doesn't matter if I'm at a community event, a high school, a farm, a church event, or even at Remembrance Day events. I've had the opportunity, as I'm sure all of my colleagues have, to attend those Remembrance Day services during our constituency week, and it's always a privilege to participate and particularly to meet our veterans and their family members. But you know, it's always the same, and even at Remembrance Day events, the question is the same. How and when are you getting rid of this Prime Minister? These Liberals are destroying the Canada that we knew and that we loved and that we fought for. It's a sad indictment of this failed government and their radical woke policies. On the other hand, they do like our leader, and there's a reason for that. You see, the difference is the Leader of the Opposition is listening to Canadians. He's not lecturing. You watch the Leader of the Opposition at a rally or an event with staff, he will stand there sometimes for hours and meet every single person, take the time to talk to them, to ask them about themselves and their concerns, and he takes the time to listen to Canadians. I've seen him go for 3 hours plus at events. He's not telling people what to think, to feel, and to believe. He's not talking down to them or going after them if they say something that he disagrees with. He's actually listening to Canadians, listening to their concerns and offering up common sense solutions. Canadians are common sense people, and they trust him and our great team over on this side of the House. Canada's common sense Conservatives, to fix the problems that this government has created. You know, trust is a big deal. Once that's broken, it's awful hard to win back. And when you break trust, when you get caught often enough, as these Liberals have, it's broken. And when the people can't trust the government, that spells disaster for a country. And in a democracy, when the government doesn't trust the people, That's equally disastrous, and this government doesn't trust the people. They refuse to trust them with the truth. They refuse to listen to the growing majority of Canadians who are begging for this Prime Minister to step down, to give them the election that they're asking for, a carbon tax election, a referendum on their disastrous record. You know, speaking of disaster, the government has often been compared to the Titanic, particularly when it comes to shuffling some of these failed ministers. The ship is plowing straight ahead towards an iceberg, another scandal. And rather than switch course, the Prime Minister is busy rearranging the deck chairs. This combination didn't work for the Titanic, and it's not going to work here neither. But he continues on with that. He shuffles the chairs. He sees a minister failing in one or two or more portfolios, and he promotes them to a third. And then I think there's a secondary way we could look at this comparison, particularly in relation to an iceberg being a scandal, including the scandal of the SDTC. Because when you see an iceberg, 90% of it is underwater. It's hidden from view. And that's often how scandals work. We only see 10%. We only see a small sliver, and there's an indication that there's something going on here. Something doesn't feel right. Something's amiss here. But it's only 10% of the real scandal, the 90% that's hidden from view. So, you know, they want to keep talking about this motion because they want to keep covering it up. They refuse to hand over the documents. And it begs the question, what else are they hiding? What else is that 90% that we have yet not even discovered? So it's dangerous to Canadians, but it's far more dangerous to this government and the Prime Minister to shed the light onto that. And the sad part, Madam Speaker, is that these Liberals are desperately trying to cover up their latest scandal, to protect the Prime Minister who's not worth the cost, the chaos, or the corruption. But Canadians are hurting, and they're afraid. Like I said, I go home every weekend so I can connect to and hear from my constituents. A lot of folks can't afford to eat, heat, or house themselves in Canada. Many of these folks have good jobs, and some of them even more than one job. They work hard, they work long hours, but they still can't afford the skyrocketing cost of living under this government. This government who has borrowed, printed, and spent money so recklessly as to double the size of our national debt. This Prime Minister has spent more money than every other Prime Minister and government in our history combined. They are addicted to spending. Madam Speaker, there's solutions for people that are addicted, and that's to get addictions counseling. And I think that's what this government needs. Because of this addiction, everyday Canadians are forced to make sacrifices, and they're getting tired of doing it. They're sick of the corruption that they see happening here in Ottawa. They're sick of this government having their hand in their pocket. Sick of being told what to think, feel, and believe. Sick of the arrogant, I know better than you attitude that pervades from this Liberal government. And they're fed up with seeing their hard-earned money that should be going to feed their kids, fix a house, maybe go into a savings account for a rainy day, go into the pockets of wealthy and well-connected Liberals like what has happened at the SDTC. And here on the opposition benches, at least Conservatives, we're saying we understand, we hear you, we agree, and we're standing up for you and your interests in Ottawa. We're here trying to hold this government accountable for the money that they've stolen. And yes, I mean stolen. They've stolen it from you, the taxpayer. SDTC, this green slush fund, where Liberals took taxpayer dollars and gave them to their own companies, that's theft. ArriveCan was theft. This government, this Prime Minister need to be held accountable. And to that extent, they must be held accountable. To what extent they must be held accountable, we will not know until we actually see the full damage. Until we see the documents, and until we know, Canadians know, what was happening with that 90% under the water. Now, that sad reality, as I mentioned earlier, is while we sit here debating what is really undebatable. I mean, the folks at STC took nearly $400 million of taxpayer dollars and gave it to themselves. That's indefensible. But the sad reality is, while we're here debating this, there's other important issues that we're not able to address. The government's failure to be transparent has bogged us down in process for weeks now. All they need to do, Madam Speaker, all they need to do so that this House can continue with the good work that it should be doing is to come clean, present the documents, unredacted, as they've been requested to do by the Speaker of his House, and we can all get back to the important issues. But, Madam Speaker, they won't do that. They refuse. They are way more concerned with their own plight than that with the people that they're supposed to be serving. But I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about some of the issues folks in my riding of Provencher are bringing to me and saying this is what could have been done with the $400 million. You know, I've already mentioned some of the scandals and the Liberal corruption and the desire for the Prime Minister to finally take a hint and resign. And I've mentioned some of the major issues for my people, but I think really for the country, it's the cost of living. But here's a few more. During COVID and the abuses heaped by the government all levels, at all levels on citizens still remains a major issue in my riding. The damage restrictions and vaccine mandates did to the social fabric of our communities and to a generation of young people. 2 years ago, when we were debating Bill C-293 in this House, I raised the troubling reality that some 51,714 documented Canadians had suffered vaccine injuries as a result of their COVID shots. At the time, I reported, based on the numbers available on the government's website, that 10,501 people suffered severe reactions, including 874 anaphylactic reactions, 1,342 cases of myocarditis, 104 thrombosis cases, and 382 reports that had an outcome of death. I also shared that despite all the government's vaccine injury support program had paid out a mere 8 claims. And many Canadians don't know this, but the government does actually have a vaccine injury support program. It's called VISP. It can be found on the Government of Canada website. That was November of 2022. 2 years later, November 2024, where we are today, the number of injuries has risen to 58,712, with 488 reported deaths. And after 2 years, you want to know how many claims have been approved? A mere 183. Thousands of injury, thousands of claims, a mere 183 claims have been approved, and there's still question as to whether or not they've actually issued compensation. And now the truly bizarre thing is, back in April, the government added another $36 million to the existing $75 million they had allocated to the vaccine injury support program. So why aren't the folks getting their money? The folks over at SDTC seem to have no problem dispersing nearly $400 million in fairly quick order. These injured folks did what the government told them to do. This Prime Minister and all of these ministers looked down the lens of a camera and told Canadians to get these shots, that they were safe and effective. Every day we heard from the Prime Minister. Every day he came out and he told Canadians, get the shot, it's going to prevent you from getting sick. Well, that didn't work. Well, it's going to prevent you from transmitting COVID to somebody else. Well, that didn't work. Well, it's going to prevent you from going to the hospital. But, Madam Speaker, that didn't work. Well, it's going to prevent you from being in the ICU. Well, that didn't work. Well, it's going to prevent you from dying. Well, you know what, Madam Speaker? It didn't prevent that neither. And in fact, the greatest amount of deaths from COVID are those that are triple vaccinated.
Point of order, the honourman for Kitchener Centre.
Just rising, Madam Speaker, to understand the relevancy of the current speech to the motion, which I believe is meant to be about SDTC, and I wonder if you can give a comment on that.
The honourable member, I appreciate the input. There is some latitude, but the honourable member did clearly indicate, did link it to the SDTC in some form, and I'm sure that you know, as he continues his speech, there'll be more relevance as well. So the honourable member for Provencher.
Madam Speaker, you know, the member does ask a very interesting question. I wish he would have been listening to what I was saying, because he would have understood that there was relevance to what I was saying. The relevance was the misinformation and the disinformation provided by this Liberal government, the Prime Minister, to Canadians about the safety and effectiveness of the vaccines. There have been vaccine injury support program claims made by Canadians who have had negative experiences, and I hear from many of them in my constituency office and in my Hill office here. Those claims are not being approved in a judicious manner, and they're not being paid out like they should be. And that's the whole point. SDTC officials had no problem getting $400 million out the door, but the over $100 million that's been ear-tagged for vaccine injuries seems to be lagging significantly. And that's my point, Madam Speaker, that the money isn't getting out the door. It seemed to somehow get out of the door for Liberal insiders, but not for people that did what the government asked them to do and suffered negative consequences for it. Those people are not getting reimbursed, and they should be. You know, in fact, what they are being offered instead of cash, they're being offered MAID. And that's so incredibly sad. And I have stories from the vaccine-injured people in my office of people, instead of being so frustrated with their injuries and failing to be recognized for the hardships that they're going through, have been offered MAID, and some have actually participated in that program. And that's incredibly sad, Madam Speaker. So the message I bring to this government from my constituents is just butt out. Provide the basic services government is supposed to provide, and then back off and let people live their lives. My constituents want the government to axe the tax, stop the reckless deficit spending, stop the alarmist anti-energy crusade, and embrace responsible resource development. Under this Prime Minister, Canada is going through the worst decline in our living standards in 40 years. Worst drop in income per person in the G7, and the worst economic growth in the OECD. But this Prime Minister and his radical woke environmental minister just keep making things worse by attacking Canadian energy and energy workers. Their latest scheme, this emissions cap, they claim it's an emissions cap. It's not really an emissions cap. This is not a cap on emissions. It's a cap on responsible Canadian oil production. It's a cap on jobs. It's a cap on paycheck. And it's a cap on prosperity for Canada. And so let's not label it a cap on emissions. Let's label it for what it is, and that's that this Liberal government wants to cap Canadians. The government's own analysis admits that the cap is going to cost Canada billions of dollars and thousands of jobs. You'd think that they would have learned their lesson from previous failures attacking the energy sector, but it seems as because they've missed every single climate target with their carbon tax, and all they've done is make people exponentially poorer. This Prime Minister and his radical environmental minister refused to accept Canada's energy sector as the country's single largest private sector investor in clean technology. Canadian oil and gas are the best in the world. The sector has a clear record of reducing emissions and adhering to the highest standards of environmental protection. And not to mention, in 2022, the oil and gas industry provided $45 billion in revenue to Canadian governments, funding schools, hospitals, roads, and other crucial public infrastructure. But instead of celebrating this and working with Canada's energy workers to tackle environmental issues, they want to crush the energy sector, putting hundreds of thousands of jobs at risk at the worst time possible. This ideological crusade against Canadian energy must end. We could be working to fix the budget. We could be working on common sense energy policies to get Canada's economy booming again. But we're stuck here instead talking about another Liberal scandal. And here's a big one, immigration, a significant concern in my riding. My office does a lot of work on immigration files. We help hundreds, if not thousands, of people a year, Canadians and those seeking to become Canadians, but our immigration system is broken. It's out of control. The government finally admitted that a couple of weeks ago, and again, I believe, just recently, and that their radical, reckless, and uncontrolled immigration policies are partly to blame for joblessness, housing crisis, and healthcare crisis that Canadians are facing. The Liberals increased population growth by over 200% the last several years. They did it without ensuring adequate housing, health care, and that jobs are available for newcomers. The government also failed spectacularly to ensure that those flooding into the country were given proper background checks. And to add insult to injury, the Prime Minister called Canadians who questioned his reckless policy, he called them racists. I can just say on behalf of the incredibly diverse group of people and newcomers in my office that my office has helped, and those who have lived here for years, it is not racist to ask why the government is bringing upwards of 1 million new people each year when there aren't even enough homes for Canadians, including many new Canadians who are already here. It's not racist to question the wisdom of bringing in more people who will cause additional strain to an already untenable healthcare system and our social safety net, when Canadians are unable to access those programs, when they're forced to wait unacceptably long periods to receive services that they've paid for with their tax dollars. The government's failures on immigration are almost too many to chronicle. Madam Speaker, I've got more that I could say here, but I think I'm going to wrap it up. You've indicated that my time has come to an end. And with that, Madam Speaker, there have been discussions amongst the parties, and if you seek it, I am confident that you will find unanimous consent to see the clock at 7:32.